So, if you've seen the news, I'm sure many of you have. There's been some incredible innovation and some amazing biological and scientific achievements that have happened over the last few weeks with Colossal. And we are absolutely thrilled to be joined by the Chief Animal Officer of Colossal Biosciences. He also was the Senior Director of Animal Care for the Dallas Zoo and Zoo Miami. He is Matt James. Matt, it's great to have you here, and to say this has been one that Stephen and I have been looking forward to is an understatement. How you been, man?
I've been great. We've been keeping a little busy, as you might know. We're just excited to be spreading the word finally. We've been sitting on some of this news since October. So,
Wow.
it's been great to be able to talk about it with all our friends and family. So it's been amazing.
I can imagine the the sword to secrecy is sort of like a Marvel movie. You gotta, I don't know how tight everything is over there, but it's great to be able to speak about it. Just before we really jump into all the stuff that people are going to want to listen to, just give everybody a brief background on yourself. How did you get into animal husbandry, welfare, that welfare experience, and then how did that lead to you going to Colossal?
Well, I've been, passionate about wildlife pretty much my entire life. I was an Army brat. I grew up all over the world, born in Germany, lived in 12 US states. The only constant that I ever had in my life was a love for nature, right? And so you kind of find those constants in every place you live. And so growing up, my mom was always really good about pushing me into the natural sciences. She's like, clearly you like biology, you like science. I was the only one of the three boys in my family that liked science. They were all more like humanities nerds, not interesting people, right? We were really focused on the sciences. So she pushed me into that. And I did some undergrad work where I kind of did everything from genetics to ecology to just standard biology. And I was trying to figure out what the hell am I going to do with my life, right? I was 22, I was graduating college and had an opportunity to go study molecular biology, do a PhD at the University of Nebraska Medical Center, and that's where I was going to undergrad in Nebraska, or I had an opportunity to go study ecology and wetland sciences in South Carolina. And having just spent 4 miserable winters in Nebraska, I was like, well, I know what I'm doing, right? I'm going to the beach. So I went to the beach and I studied ecology at Coastal Carolina University. And when I got done with that, I thought, hey, everybody in my program pretty much goes to work in a state agency and work at some state level or federal level, natural resources position. And I thought, well, that's not what I want to do. And I was cruising Craigslist one night, as one guy does when he's 22, and it was a safe place then to do that, I guess. I found a job posting to go train dolphins in Miami. And I was like, well, that's what I want to do. I want to go live in South Beach. I want to go play with dolphins, that whole thing. Well, turned out that was a really good decision, even though it sounds like, I'm really kind of making light of it, because I found this incredible passion for working with animals in human care, sort of working on that front line as that last bastion against extinction for species that are struggling in the wild. We're creating these sort of Noah's Ark populations in zoos. And so I kind of grew up through that system, and I worked at one aquarium, then another, and then somebody called and said, hey, that stuff you're doing with dolphins is really interesting. Do you want to work with elephants? So, yeah, with elephants. I was 25. I could do anything in the world, right? I know I was smarter than everybody. And you get humbled really quickly, and you go and try something new, like working with elephants that you'd never worked with before. And I learned a ton and found a huge passion for not only the sort of the animals in human care, but how that trickles into conservation in the field. And so I grew up in the zoo world, and until I was about, I guess, 36, 37 years old, I found myself at the Dallas Zoo as the general curator, senior director of animal care, when Ben Lamb came up with this idea to use woolly mammoths as a way to re-engineer ecosystems, right? Bring woolly mammoths back from extinction. He called me about it and thought, well, that's just a ridiculous idea. Like, what are you doing? Like, you don't know what you're doing with elephants. You don't know elephant reproduction. You don't know. And he said, yeah, you get it. You know all the right questions. He's like, why don't you come answer those questions with us? So he challenged me to join Colossal. It was right after COVID too. I think everybody post-COVID was a little shook, and they're like, very introspective, going, what am I doing with my life? How am I making my impacts? And I thought, I have never seen an opportunity presented to me before that could create impact and change at the scale that Colossal offers, right? If we can unlock the technologies that Ben was talking about at the time, I thought, oh my gosh, imagine what we could do for animals on the brink of extinction. Imagine what we could do in terms of telling the story of conservation and critically endangered species and degraded ecosystems. And so I jumped on board. That was 3.5 years ago. And now today we get to tell the world, hey, de-extinction isn't just an idea. It's a process that has a proof point. Like we've shown that from end to end, these technologies work. And not only that, we found a way to apply it to red wolf conservation.
So you've really had your hands in every single solitary thing going through, a decade and a half or so here. This is pretty crazy. Just tell everyone then, could you sort of laid out the mission, but what is the basic mission behind Colossal? Because you said a bunch of different things about de-extinction and rewilding and helping ecosystems. What is that main mission behind Colossal?
So the simplest explanation of Colossal is that, we are a biotechnology company and we are the first de-extinction and species preservation company in the world. The mission of Colossal, simply that vision statement that we use, is to make extinction a thing of the past. How can we create technologies that not only reverse extinction events like the direwolf or the woolly mammoth, but how can we prevent future extinctions by leveraging biotechnology? Biotech is an expensive, hard hobby. Right? People don't just do it. Right? Conservation struggles to raise funds for some of the fundamental needs of conventional conservation. I experienced that firsthand. Colossal represents an opportunity to bring very leading edge technology into this space, as well as funds that were never being given to the conservation space, as well as eyeballs that weren't paying attention to the conservation fight before.
Is that why when you go down this path of de-extinction, because more people are obviously throwing this around now with the news of the direwolf, with more people getting eyeballs on Colossal itself, is that why it was started to go down the de-extinction path, to get more funding, to get more eyeballs on these things, as opposed to regular conservation, where people are obviously struggling to save these species that are on the brink, when we talk about rhino and elephant and wolf and all these other things?
Yeah, I think it's sort of both, right? It's yes and, right? Yes, we thought that de-extinction would bring funding and attention to an area that needed both of those things. And yes, we also believe that de-extinction can be a fundamental tool to repair broken ecosystems, to repair lost ecosystems. We have brought new tools from a technological perspective to the conservation fight. I think we're also representing a new economic tool to conservation. How can for-profit companies act in the best interest of nature? Forever, we villainized for-profit companies for the extraction of nature, right? You could never value a tree until you cut it down.
Right.
It had an economic value. Now, if we can create technologies that bring attention and funding to an ecosystem, like say Tasmania, where the Tasmanian tiger once persisted, and we could restore it to that system, we're bringing money to that because of all the attention to de-extinction. And now we can preserve habitat for the thylacine. And then ecotourism comes into play. And then things like, all the IP and technology that it took to make a thylacine is the way that Colossal can generate funds to keep sustaining these projects.
Can we start on the basics? I guess, can you just demystify this word de-extinction in a technical sense?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it gets even more complicated when we start talking about species definitions and sort of this never-ending human need to bucket things that nature doesn't care about, right? Nature works in a fluid spectrum. We work in these defined buckets because it helps us communicate and manage resources. So de-extinction, right, is we're not talking about cloning a species that went extinct 12,500 years ago. In order to work with the DNA from a species that old, you just don't have viable DNA. You can't just clone it the way we clone Dolly the sheep.
Right.
Cloning is a fundamental step of de-extinction. What we're talking about is how can we look at species that went extinct, look at their closest living relatives today, compare and contrast those species from a genomic level, which is sort of the magic of Colossal, and then begin to identify genes that were most important that created the difference between those two species, and then edit cell lines of that close living animal until it becomes that extinct species. And then you use the cloning process to create offspring. So we're talking about functional de-extinction, this idea that how can we restore ecosystem functions? How can you bring back a species function, which includes its phenotype? So it should look and act like a woolly mammoth and a direwolf, but how does it perform a function back in nature that is beneficial to the ecosystem around it? So that's functional de-extinction. That's how we focus on it. I think people get very caught up in, is it 100% direwolf? Well, guess what? We sequenced 2 direwolves. These direwolves existed 60,000 years apart from each other in different parts of North America. The likelihood that they were the exact same height, size, color, similar behavior is very low, right? We know that there's enormous individual variation. So you never have to worry about being 100% of something unless you're trying to copy a facsimile of that individual. What we're doing is how can we make an animal that could be injected into an ecosystem and perform the same function that the lost one did.
So it should at some point or will or could occupy the same niche in the ecosystem or have the same function that's the point.
Exactly. It's not too dissimilar to what we saw in Yellowstone when Canadian gray wolves were brought into Yellowstone National Park to perform the function of the lost gray wolves there. But the gray wolves that would have historically roamed Yellowstone National Park were probably phenotypically different, behaviorally different than the animals that came from Canada to start that rewilding process. However, they performed a function and they did an amazing job of it to the point where we saw a control of an elk population. We saw restoration of beaver populations. So, you saw these cascading effects.
So when you talk about these genetics and getting things as close as possible, one, where is this coming from? Because I did listen to a little bit of Ben when he's been doing his circulatory stuff about getting DNA and genetics from different skulls or bones or things like that. And does that also tie into what you were just saying before about getting some feedback from folks that are looking at the direwolf specifically and saying it doesn't exactly fit in the bucket that we're used to seeing?
Yeah, so the source DNA comes from, it's funny. It's sort of like it takes a village to de-extinct a species, right? This comes from a vast network of partnerships, whether that's museums or academic partners, whether that's working with paleontologists that are in the field digging up new specimens, or we're actually leading expeditions to go get those new specimens. But that said, that means we're working across a vast distribution of direwolves. And, direwolves had a pretty wide distribution from southern Canada all the way into like northern South America. And they also persisted across ice ages and interglacial periods. So they had this huge temporal and spatial distribution, which meant there was significant variety between them. So if you were a direwolf that existed 13,000 years ago in Peru, how genomically similar and how phenotypically similar were you to a direwolf that existed in southern Canada 150,000 years ago? My guess is pretty different. So when we get these questions about, is it the exact same direwolf? It's like, well, it's a very hard question to answer because we would consider those 2 direwolves probably distinct from each other as much as they would consider our direwolf distinct from any one of those 2.
Right. I mean, given that this was only recently made possible, what were the important discoveries in the way of science and technology that allowed you to make this a reality?
The biggest advancement needed for direwolf in particular, and I'll put the caveat that this is specific to direwolf, probably plays a role in everything we do. But if we look at all the species we work with, direwolf, dodo, mammoth, thylacine, if you look at those, they each have sort of their advantages of this is the low-hanging fruit, which makes this an attractive project, and the cons of this is what makes this very difficult, right? For direwolf, it was the fact that these animals were not Arctic-dwelling glacial animals that died in a freezer and are stored in the permafrost like woolly mammoths.
Got it.
Right. Woolly mammoths did us a favor. They died in freezers. The preservation of the tissue is incredible, of the DNA is incredible. We actually have 54 woolly mammoth genomes, which is incredible. When we started direwolf, there was only one genome ever produced. Luckily, our chief scientist, Beth Shapiro, was on the paper that did that. that genome only produced what they call 0.25x coverage of the genome. So only 25% of the genome was sequenced even one time. What we did is we improved on the genome. We had better DNA extraction. We had better genomic sequencing technologies. Now we're 5 years later. So, technologies have advanced. We created a 13x coverage genome. So we covered the genome 13 times. So we have about 500 times more data than what the previous genome had, which gives us a much higher resolution into what a direwolf was. Wow. That is a fundamentally important step to be able to do the comparison and contrasting needed between direwolf and gray wolf. It was also fundamental in identifying the gray wolf definitively as the closest living relative of the direwolf. Those two steps are really key to allowing us to be moved. Then you get into sort of the de-extinction pathway I talked about. Use tools like CRISPR,
right,
and use artificial intelligence to help you identify which genes you should be pulling from direwolf into gray wolf. And then you begin the gene editing process.
And so with the mammoth so much further ahead, why the direwolf first?
Well, we've been working on mammoth for 3.5 years. George Church's lab has been working on it for 10 years before that. What we're talking about with woolly mammoths is a much larger genome, about 4 billion base pairs in the mammoth genome. So a lot more changes needed, but also reproductive science of canids is very well understood. The reproductive science of elephants is still a mystery. It's still very challenging for scientists and for our team included to work with. Then you're talking about gestational periods. In a canid is 60 to 63 days. In an elephant is 22, 23 months. So right, you begin to really, your timelines start to spread fast. So we certainly started with mammoth because we have such great genomic data. But in the midst of doing mammoth thylacine dodo, we also found, oh my gosh, this project is sort of right there and it's ripe for the taking. Right. And it's a great proof point for us to show that this end-to-end de-extinction platform works.
Can you just talk about what CRISPR is exactly and how that plays a part?
Yeah, first we should start with, I'm not the geneticist in the room, right? I'm just the dumb guy that absorbs what all the smart people talk about. The second is, CRISPR is this, this amazing tool that basically is already found in nature. There's a bacteria that has this protein unit that is able to literally cut DNA in very specific places. So you can give it a primer to tell it where it cuts a DNA and then a DNA sequence, and then you can drop segments of your DNA of interest in. So it's sort of a cut and paste tool for gene editing. Wow. Today, we have much more precise methods as well that we can utilize, and CRISPR continues to get better. So that is a fundamental tool in gene editing is CRISPR technology. And that would not, de-extinction would not be possible today without gene editing.
Wow.
I mean, you don't sound like to your words, the dumb guy in the room. You're having the answers here so far. So take it from us. So when this comes to fruition, I mean, what was the point for you all? I don't know if Stephen asked this just before, because I've just been trying to take it all in here. Like when you realized the direwolf was a viability, it was going to be viable. It was something that was going to happen, and that it was going to be the first species that you guys were going to be able to actually viably show to the public. When did that all turn around and say, all right, we have a process, a gestation period, it's going to work, moving forward?
So when this whole direwolf thing started, there were sort of a series of events, a series of sort of, it's one of those things where the universe kept putting direwolf in front of us. And so we had an amazing discussion with some of our indigenous partners at MHA Nation that really sort of made us start thinking about direwolf. We were starting to talk about wolf conservation and ways we should use our technology for wolves. And then we had this really cool brainstorming session where we had great, paleogeneticists like Beth. At the time, Beth hadn't even joined the company as our CSO. She was still just an advisor, and Lou Vidal and a few others. And I remember we were in a room just next to me where I am now, and there was a big whiteboard in it. And we're just saying, what extinct species do we have genomic data for? What extinct species can we access tissues for? What extinct species have reproductive pathways that would work? And we made this big list, right? 40 odd species. And direwolf was on that list. And then when we looked at the genome and we realized it was so poor, we're like, well, it's going to make it really difficult. We thought, well, we can improve on the genome, so let's give that a go. And when the genome came back with this great coverage and we had this amazing genomic data, suddenly felt like, oh, this is really possible. So that's when we fired up a team to start on the gene editing, doing all the computational biology, all the genomic engineering, the cell engineering. And my team started working on the reproductive front. I would say even at that point, I was like, okay, yeah, one day maybe we'll do this, right? But I wasn't going, oh my gosh, this is so easy, right? This is really hard stuff, even for the direwolf. And so it wasn't until we got that first confirmed pregnancy, I think, that I thought, holy crap, like this is happening. And I remember calling my team and saying, wow, hey guys, this isn't a drill. I need you, everybody on site. We're going to start planning whelping plans for a direwolf. We had already written this amazing animal care manual, but even that was sort of written as this aspirational guideline that we would use one day. And it was like, no, it's happening. And so, we get to the birth, and these were planned cesarean sections. So I'm standing in an observation room looking into our operating room as the animals are coming out, and you see the first two flashes of white as the vet tech is passing the wolves off, and we run over to the treatment room and we pop into action. We start doing all the resuscitation work, and we're checking vitals, and we're making sure. And then all of a sudden you start to hear that first little puppy cry, and you're like, oh man, like, whoa, it's happening right now. Like we've achieved this thing that many thought we couldn't, that sometimes you doubted yourself. So it was a surreal moment. And then it was like, oh crap, get back to work. Yeah.
I mean,
oh my goodness.
So, I mean, now that you have these, I mean, they're not full grown, obviously, right? How old are they now?
But a little more than 6 months and 3 months.
Yeah. That's enough to start, seeing what they're going to look like. I mean, so John and I are familiar with the faces of dozens of wolves. If we look at this particular individual or these individuals, what do we notice that's maybe a dead giveaway for a dire wolf, or is it just too subtle at the moment to see it?
Well, I got to get you out so that you can see them and you can do this yourself, because you guys are going to be much better at this than I am. But I think the first thing you'll notice is that from a build perspective, they're a very robust animal, right? They're tall, they're lanky, but they have a lot of width. And then their coat is really distinct, is that they almost have this like mane-like feature, like the very long coat with a lot of guard hairs, and around their neck it sort of pops out like a mane or a beard. Wow. And so that's really distinct to me. But yeah, the hair is really telling. Really? But the build, and then you'll see, I think they're still young. They haven't hit that sort of testosterone surge that the males will have. But their jawline already looks to be a little more robust.
And in terms of like weight and just size, comparable to a gray wolf, or?
Yeah, they're running, from the data we have on gray wolf sort of milestones based on weight, we're seeing about a 20% increase in weight. So when the boys were 5 months old, they were just at 80 pounds.
That's a big animal.
So, I mean, how large was the Pleistocene direwolf? And do you expect these individuals to be that big on the first litter, or is that going to take multiple litters, or how does that work?
Yeah, so direwolves, from what we know, were about 130 to 150 pounds. So they were that 25% larger than a gray wolf, right? We know that we see those 110 pound male gray wolves, and on occasion you might, people reported 140 pound gray wolves. Whether that's before, like right after a meal or something, who knows? But I've never seen a 140 pound gray wolf. Like, that's insane. We think we're sort of on that trajectory for 100 pounds out of Romulus and Remus. Yeah, Khaleesi will probably be a little smaller as a female.
So this just doesn't take long to see an individual that looks like a direwolf.
No, but so one of the things we did, and when we get into this sort of is it 100% direwolf discussion, is we were really intentional about the edits we chose. Right, we wanted to have sort of what was the minimal viable product to create a direwolf, and control as many variables as possible to ensure positive welfare outcomes. We didn't want to say, oh, well, we know we can put 1,000 edits into the cell line, but we also, every time you put an edit in, you sort of increase your level of risk. that the animal could have, the fetus could terminate, or there could be some sort of, some issue with the editing that we were unaware of. So we were very intentional in doing that. Now that we know more, you could go, if you were so inclined, you could go back to the table and go, all right, we feel really good about these 20 edits. Now let's explore the next 10 and the next 10, next 10.
That's wild. I mean, what are the edits for this first go with Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi that you guys were looking at to, like you say, have viable, healthy direwolves on this? Like, what were the edits that you were making sure that were in place in order for this to be as successful as possible?
So we were really focused on what we knew about the phenotypic differences before the two. So that was size, stature, jaw structure, facial cranial structure. We also identified, because we know so much about canid genetics, which really helped us in our sort of AI-powered educated guessing as to what each gene did. We were able to identify coat issues that we could see were clearly different in the genomes. However, we also knew in coat that in some species, like in gray wolf, a white coat, which we were finding white in the genomes of direwolf, white coats in gray wolves can sometimes be associated with deafness or blindness.
Mm-hmm.
So we said, well, we want to make sure we avoid that. We don't want to roll the dice on creating a deaf or blind animal unintentionally. But we know that in other canids, white exists and doesn't have those effects. So we actually grabbed white from a domestic dog for this. So we have 20 edits. Only 15 of them are true direwolf variants. Because 5 of them we wanted to ensure we wouldn't have specific, related sequela from those edits. So we grabbed other variants. That's now, if you're a purist, you go, well, that's not a direwolf, right? Well, if you're an animal welfare person, you go, well, that was a really smart decision. So the truth is somewhere between there. Right. Is that a white coat is a white coat, whether it was the direwolf variant of white or it was a domestic dog variant of white. Phenotypically, functionally, it's the same edit.
And where did the gray wolf that was included in this process come from? I mean, how did that selection process happen?
Well, so the gray wolf genome in general, we were able to get tons and tons of samples, and there's a lot of published data that we were able to work from. In order to work with the cell line, we worked with a gray wolf sanctuary that was able to say, hey, here's some samples so you can create baseline cells for these animals. We biobank those cells for conservation, and then we also use those cells as the basis of our editing.
But so the mother who you mentioned, there was a C-section, so there's
yeah. So the mother in this case is a domestic dog.
I see. So I guess it doesn't really matter so much as long as it's species.
Yeah, Canis lupus, whether it's a domestic dog or it's a gray wolf, they're from a reproductive physiology standpoint, they were compatible. So for us, it was better to not work with the endangered species. It was better to work with a domestic dog.
Okay.
Well,
is there a thought? I'm sure there is a thought process for you guys as this continues on down the road. Are you looking at not having living gestation and having these animals in sort of controlled pods or something in that way, so that it's not using a living thing to breed another living thing, and also thinking about the life of the animal that's breeding what's being brought back?
Yeah, I mean, we're not just thinking about it. We have a 17-person team dedicated to it. So that team is called ExoDev, which is short for exogenous development. So their team, they're tasked with trying to create biomedical devices that can gestate embryos from one cell fertilization all the way to birth. That sounds science fiction and crazy, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it all does so far.
From a conservation standpoint, if we want to be able to scale populations quickly, if you want to be able to pursue de-extinction and have sort of the most control of the variables, reduce impact on wildlife, ExoDev or our artificial womb project is sort of critical to that success. Also, if you want to get into species in which a gestational carrier is not currently available, say, for example, we've always had this dream that one day we could work on stellar sea cow. We could help bring the stellar sea cow back. But that is basically a dugong that's the size of a whale, right? Nothing on this earth today can gestate a stellar sea cow. But if we could create an artificial womb that's capable of doing just that, then we could bring back species we never thought we could.
Wow. So, I mean, so tell us about where these pups are living and what they're eating, and how are they experiencing close or distant human contact, or how is that all looking?
Yeah. So, right. For the sake of the wolves, for the sake of my staff, we haven't told anybody where the preserve is, but we have,
Sure.
we have a 2,000-acre preserve in the northern United States. Well, that's as much as we say, basically. But these animals live this, I would best describe it as semi-wildlife. They were born to a domestic dog. We had elected to hand rear them, so they're reared on bottles around humans. When they weaned, we began to remove human intervention. We sort of used, the type of work that you guys do. All that experience was really critical to us learning how could we begin to remove ourselves from these wolves. At 6 months old, these guys basically come in for mealtime. That's it. They come in for a daily check. The keepers see them. They get fed, and we're starting to transition them from the ground meats and the kibbles for nutrients to carcass feedings. And soon we'll just drive the truck out, drop the carcass, and leave, and then we'll check back on them in a few days. That's where we're heading, but as you guys well know, it's sort of a stepwise process to graduate to that point.
So Matt, what's because we're going to get around to this thing eventually. And I think people are looking at this and saying that this is, to me personally, this is an incredible achievement to bring this animal back and the others that you're working on. So where does this fall in sort of the ecosystem restoration conservation aspect? Because from what I've been reading, these animals are not getting released into the wild. This is specific to that. I guess before the conservation and ecosystem restoration question, what is the ultimate goal for the direwolves going forward? Are we talking about a pack on this preserve? What are you guys looking at future-wise?
Yeah, well, we were just talking that we would like to grow the pack to about 6 or 8, sort of a nice social size pack. So that would involve, another litter. But these wolves themselves they're in their forever home. They're doing exactly what we want them to do. We can study a lot about these wolves where they are today. These guys are a fundamental step to the success of de-extinction as a whole. So their impact is really on sort of being Dolly the sheep was fundamental to understanding cloning, and we learned a lot from that. Romulus, Remus, Khaleesi are no different. So what we're doing now is we're just observing the animals. We're able to take regular, measurements of the animals. They do have some obviously significant habituation to people, and there's a lot of training involved to help them so that they can participate in their health care. We can grab voluntary measurements. We can weigh them, things like that. But we're also learning what are the genetic and epigenetic effects of cloning, of gene editing. We're also learning about, what are the ways to mitigate risk in the de-extinction process. So, the IUCN, 9 years ago, put out a guideline called the Proxy Species Rewilding Guideline. It's essentially a guideline around if you were to pursue de-extinction, these are the considerations you should make. We were very intentional to use that as a roadmap for our strategies as we were creating strategies towards de-extinction. One of those is this idea that you should create and study the impacts of your work on a captive population before you pursue this for rewilding purposes. So this is sort of fundamental to that step. And so now we will continue to learn a lot from these animals. This has become a living laboratory where we can understand what are the impacts that they have on 2,000 acres of land, what are the impacts of the work on the individual animals, and where do we need to change strategies, double down on other strategies, things like that.
And on the topic of rewilding, talk about how the direwolf plays a part in that vision for, this futuristic ecosystem where Pleistocene species are once again playing a role.
Well, obviously we have multiple Pleistocene species that we're looking at rewilding, and we really love what Pleistocene Park has done in Siberia, what the Simovs have understood, the way that you can re-engineer ecosystems to help improve soil temperatures, reduce carbon emissions, even lift biodiversity. So we're looking at ways that we can do all of those things. If you're going to recreate a Pleistocene Park, you're going to have mega herbivores out on a landscape. You probably need a predator that could help control those populations. So we're not planning on it right now, but we have always talked like one day you could potentially use that as a predator on that landscape in a highly fenced, biosecure, sort of like a la South Africa conservation concession type of scheme.
Right.
But more than anything, we're just going to continue to work with these three animals in the next litter in order to understand more and more and more about the animals, how to rewild them more successfully, how can we remove human intervention more successfully, things like that.
So you'd have to also, I think you kind of mentioned it there, but so you would have to also basically de-extinct a prey base.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's a long term. I mean, that's
I think people get caught up all the time. We've seen in the last 2 weeks. They're like, well, the giant ground sloth doesn't exist anymore. And you go, you're right, it doesn't. We're not saying that they're going to be turned down. They're going to be eating, American bison. That's not that's the plan. We're not going to turn them out at all. We're just going to work in this secure preserve. But in the future, I think you could one day envision, 100,000, 1 million acres fenced preserve where this type of experiment is occurring. And we could see about what happens when you begin to turn tundra back into grassland.
Yeah, that's definitely something I wanted to talk about, the tundra to grassland concept. Can you sort of break that down a bit and talk about just how de-extinction plays a part in that?
Yeah, because I've read this. I just finished Rewilding, that book by Paul Jepson, and it was just, and the other authors, I'm blanking right now, but this was sort of at the forefront of this, where they've been transporting bison and horse and musk oxen to those places. So go in.
Mammoth would be just like 10 times that.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So if you're not familiar with Pleistocene Park, there's a father-son pair of researchers in Siberia. Obviously, with the Ukrainian conflict, we haven't heard as much from them in the last 3-4 years. But the idea that they had, and that Paul Jepson talks about in Rewilding, is this idea that there are, when the mammoth persisted, before it went extinct 4,000 years ago, right? If you turn the clock back 100,000 years, you go to these areas of the circumpolar north today that are just massive tundra, which, are rather barren of life, very low levels of biodiversity. Back then, these were massive grassland ecosystems called mammoth steppe grassland that was as biodiverse as the African savanna is today. So you imagine going up into these areas and you would see mammoths and woolly rhinos, you would see, Smilodon, saber-toothed cat, you would see fauna and flora that you wouldn't see anywhere else. Like it was just amazing safari type of experience, if you think about that. When the mammoth went extinct, which was sort of driven by climate change, hunting pressure from humans, hunting competition, was driving other predators extinct at the time. And as the mammoth went away, that ecosystem lost the engineer that opened up the niches within the ecosystem that allowed for other biodiversity to persist. And the whole grassland system collapsed, and now it's this tundra. Well, one of the prevailing theories, and it's highly debated, so don't think I'm taking one side or the other, is that as the tundra came on and it created this giant blanket of snow, it's sort of insulating a lot of the cold air from getting to the soil. So as we see global temperatures rising today, the cold air isn't able to touch the soil. The permafrost comes above 32 degrees. Permafrost melts. All the organic matter that's locked up in that permafrost begins to decay, releases methane and carbon dioxide, which are greenhouse gases, and accelerate the warming cycle. One of the theories is if you could restore that ecosystem, you bring these grasslands back. Number one, you're bringing plants back to an ecosystem that sequester and hold on to lots of carbon. So that's great for us in this sort of worry about emissions. Number two, you're allowing cooler air to make contact with the earth, which should, in theory, cool the permafrost and help lock up all of that organic matter. So it's a biodiversity play. There's a debatable carbon sequestration play in there as well. And to your point, getting back to Pleistocene Park, they've done this with horses and muskox and a lot of other animals. What we're talking about is one of the things they've had to do is they go in with bulldozers and they knock over trees and they turn soil and they create this they act as the engineer and
a disturbance, essentially.
Yeah. But if you have an elephant, which has been well studied in West Africa, elephants have this highly disturbing presence that turns over trees, spreads seeds, opens up ecological niches for other animals. And by knocking over the trees, opens up sunlight areas for more, for other plants to grow and spread roots. So it becomes a more biodiverse, abundant, and sort of a more resilient ecosystem than what we have there today.
It's wild. So when you're looking at the direwolves, too, just to go back to them for a moment, I don't think we touched on this. What is their life expectancy, by the way? Is it similar to the gray wolves? If they're in captivity, it's going to be longer. But what's the life expectancy? Are we talking 10 years, or we don't really know until obviously we see things play out?
Yeah, as best we can tell. And a lot of wild canids have a very similar lifespan. That's sort of that 10 to 12, maybe even up into the teens if they are really lucky. That's sort of what we're expecting. That's sort of maybe 12 to 14 years. However, gray wolves are a great example. They can live to be 14. They often don't live past 4 because of pack conflict, things like that. We're expecting to see a life expectancy similar to gray wolf. A lot of that is based on the idea that we already know they're 95.5% gray wolf, right? We already know that they share a huge genetic background with gray wolves.
Yeah, so you have that already in there.
Mm-hmm.
So staying on the ecosystem restoration, the conservation stuff that we were getting into, what have you guys been hearing in terms of the feedback with wolves that are already on the landscape, red wolves in particular, and how you're aiming to help those efforts to keep those particular species from going extinct? Or, obviously the red wolf is critically endangered. I know you guys work with Bridget von Holt, who we've had on a couple of times, about ghost wolf genes and editing like that. So what are sort of the long-term goals for species like that, where people are looking at the direwolf being brought back and it's exciting, but also, in the other hand, we have a couple of species that are already on the verge of being either taken off ESA, so on and so forth, and there's populations that are sort of going up and down?
I think first and foremost, it's easy to say for us is like, dire wolves will not be reintroduced to the wild where gray wolves are persisting, or red wolves, right? There's no point in creating a competitive species to species that are experiencing conflict, experiencing pressures of extinction today. I think, we saw a lot of knee-jerk reactions where they go, oh my God, they're going to put their dire wolves in Yellowstone. It's like, no, come on. We know this. Like, that's silly. However, I will say the technologies that we created in order to bring direwolf back are directly applicable to the conservation of gray wolf and red wolf. Now, understanding wolf extinction in North America, at least, is highly driven by conflict with humans, right? No technology is going to address that. Technology can help mitigate it to some extent, and we actually, next month we'll come out with an announcement that we can come back and revisit then about how one of the technological tools we think could be really fundamental to gray wolves. But what I'm hoping is de-extinction and the sort of the hope and the inspiration that de-extinction brings with it can act as a beacon to help drive conservation forward. First and foremost, if I talk about red wolf, I mean, you guys know Bridget, like the work she's done on this ghost wolf population could be fundamentally changing to genetically rescue an incredible icon of America. The American red wolf, only endemic wolf of America, right? It is not just, is it struggling because it's declared extinct in the wild and it's being released in North Carolina to an unfortunately not to the level of success we'd love to see it, right? But it is experiencing genetic erosion. It is experiencing these constraints of genetic bottlenecking from having a very small founder population of 14. We can use our technology to extract specific alleles from the ghost wolf population that are meaningful to altering the genetic diversity and the outcome of that population. There are 250 red wolves in captivity that are being used to repopulate the North Carolina site. unfortunately, they're in this sort of bottleneck. They're in this closed population where there is no hope for new genetic diversity. We can create that hope by bringing some of these alleles into today's population. But I also think on the conflict front, on the inspirational side, I don't think, I would guess, and you guys might have a better feel for this than I do. I would say 95% of Americans are unaware that red wolf is a species, that it is a species experiencing this horrible persecution. And what happened in the last 2 weeks is Colossal, in this media frenzy, which some people love, some people hate, created something like 400 billion media impressions, right? This massive number.
Whoa.
And if you just look at red wolf alone, just on some of the red wolf things that we put out there, we saw 8 billion media impressions. That's 8 billion times people looked at the word red wolf and looked at the crisis of the red wolf. If you look at trending topics on like Google and like hashtags and things like that, the word conservation, the word red wolf, the word extinction were trending, and more people were paying attention to them than they did 2 weeks ago. So for better or worse, the media circus brings attention to a space that was lacking the attention it deserved. So I think for me, we can be fundamentally changing to gray wolf and red wolf by bringing more attention to their plight and helping inspire people to be more interested. My email is full of kids that are saying, how do I get into what you're doing? How do I get into the conservation sciences? How do I do these things? So I'm hoping that we can make conservation. I've always thought conservation is cool, but hopefully we can make it cool and trendy where more people are trying to get into it and work towards the conservation of these species.
Because that seems to be a little bit of the angle that's coming at her. Because as I said, I've listened to a lot of, Ben doing like you said, the media circuit and the tour and the stuff you all are releasing. And it really seems to, as you mentioned, get people involved in not really the de-extinction process, but about what's happening to the species and the land that's here already. And that seems to be like one of the linchpins of what you guys are promoting. Am I wrong in that? And is that what people should be looking at more so, like sort of looking at the forest through the trees of direwolf coming back, but hey, look past that, there's other stuff on the horizon? Is that kind of what you guys are trying to mitigate with this media storm and all that?
Exactly. I think it's really important that that we can highlight these tangible, sort of secondary and tertiary benefits that de-extinction has for the conservation of species around it, for the attention it brings, and for all the and hopefully we can help highlight the efforts of the people that have been boots on the ground for years. I don't think that enough people are paying attention to red wolf. I think even, I lived in South Carolina, just 150 miles south of where those red wolves are being released. And at the time, I could tell you most of my friends and family had no idea that red wolves were being released 150 miles north of them. Any way that we can bring awareness to that, any way that we can bring eyeballs to that is critical. I think people say, one of the early sort of superficial critiques we got is, yeah, but why don't you do something for conservation? Well, number one, we are, right? We have this big ghost wolf, red wolf project we've built. But number two, de-extinction is sort of this massive ship charging through the ocean that creates this big wake and can pull tons of projects along with it. And that's what we hope. That's what we're trying to do, is create this momentum forward where this rising tide lifts all ships.
So that was going to be my next question. What are the processes, or what are the things in place for you guys as the next 2, 3, 4, 5 steps coming in to help and promote the conservation that's already going on right now? What are some of those things that are in place?
Well, so, we'll have more news coming out about our work on ghost wolf and how it relates to red wolf.
Okay.
We'll continue to invest in our conservation partners. So we have several partners in the wolf space. Like I said, we'll have an announcement that's coming out around wolves in Yellowstone in a month or so. And then we'll continue to drive canid conservation and genetics forward. So one of the big things that we did with red wolf was there had never been a reference genome created for the red wolf. This is America's only endemic wolf, and nobody could actually genomically define it at the highest level. Right? We had done whole genome sequence, so there's sort of like levels of sequencing you could do. Reference genome sort of being the gold standard. This is the most high resolution data you can produce. That's about to be published. That's totally funded and analyzed by Colossal's team. We're doing a historic red wolf analysis so if we look back in time pre-extinction, what was a red wolf versus what is it today as defined by our new reference genome. And then we're also creating what we call as pangenome, which is this idea that if you look at all the wild canids of North America, you can create sort of all the genomic data and where it lies within each species, where it overlaps with one species, where it overlaps with all species. These are really important tools for conservationists to be able to use in their pursuit, whatever their specific focus is for the conservation of these species. What's great about Colossal is we produce all that data, we upload it onto these different servers, and it's free to the conservation world. They can just download that data and use it for anything they want.
So for the red wolf and the ghost wolf stuff, are you all finding different genomes or different sequencing that's allowing the researchers and scientists to create a more specific red wolf that is more closely related to the ones that maybe if we go back 1,000 years as opposed to what's happening in the conservation efforts right now, that's been limited to whatever it is, finance, research, whatever those things are. Is that what you guys are trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we can't go back 1,000 years because we don't have this. But yeah, we are trying to go back in time to understand what was the red wolf before humans really decimated the population, right? But Bridget's work is, the foundation of all of this. Bridget and Chris Imbreski are doing pretty much all of that, right? And so what we're doing right now is trying to understand those ghost wolves in Louisiana and Texas. We know the ones that the individuals we're working with have upwards of 70% red wolf ancestry as defined by the captive population. So they're 70% similar to the captive population. But they also have a significant portion of that ghost variation that Bridget talks about, which has never been assigned to a species. That's why the pangenome is so important, because now we can say, oh, it turns out that these animals might not just be 70%. They might be 80%. They might be 85% or greater red wolf. And then you look at that population, you go, without protections, for the last 50 years, this population has persisted, right? And has not been genetically diluted. And so there are ways that we can say, well, there's this great red wolf base already present here that we should really lean into. And then on the other side of that is we also know that those animals have really key genetic differences and diversity. It can be critical to the red wolf itself. So what we want to do is work to understand that if there is high levels of coyote integration in that population, as defined by the historic sample that says before humans decimated the population, they didn't have that level of integration. Today, we see high levels of coyote integration. We can use synthetic biology tools to begin to remove the integration, begin to restore lost restore red wolf ancestry to those animals and create more red wolfy ghost wolves that then could be used to fundamentally change the recovery population.
That's wild. This is wild. Because we've talked with a lot of people who are our listeners and, people that are, we're in the wolf space, and this is by no means, and this could be out of people's depth, but it's just like when you look at the public perception and the feedback that comes with bringing something back, and then it might give folks who create legislation, create whatever it is, to say, well, if we can bring something back, we can just sort of kill it off. Again, I don't want to this is not about getting political by any stretch, but what's the way that you all are sort of combating those types of questions or arguments or thoughts that come your way, in that, well, if we have this technology, we can just sort of play with species any way we want?
First of all, it's really expensive and really hard to do. Right? I think a lot of people sort of create this moral hazard argument. Well, if you have this technology, then why should people value nature? Why should they worry about extinction? Well, it's expensive and hard. Like, it's not that simple, number one. Number two, fortunately, I don't feel that people value nature at the level they should today, and they're already decimating nature, right? But number three, I think what's really important to me, and there was some debate around the Secretary of Interior, Doug Burgum, put out a statement around how, de-extinction technology is a marvel, and it is going to be, it's going to be the focus of innovation versus regulation in our fight against nature's destruction. I think what was lost in a lot of that is he used words like species recovery. He didn't just say delisting and gutting and removing protections. He said, how can we accelerate the recovery of species? For me, that's where I think we sit. We sit on the forefront of being able to restore species. Without conventional conservation, without the Endangered Species Act, the level of loss would be horrible today. Those things the conservationists, the boots on the ground people, and the ESA have done God's work in keeping us from losing everything. However, we also still need to get to the point where we have to restore species. We have to recover species, and we should be celebrating the idea that we could recover species to the point where it doesn't need our protection anymore. We did that with the bald eagle, right? We go, oh my gosh, look at this bald eagle. It's the national emblem of the United States. It almost went extinct. We recovered the population to the point where it doesn't really need the protections anymore. Only 3% of species on ESA have ever done that, have ever gotten to that level. And that's a sobering number for me, where if we said in the last 50 years of the Endangered Species Act, the most significant piece of the legislation to the conservation world, in the last 50 years, only 3% success. Now we are holding on to what we have. We haven't lost all those species, but I would love us to create tools that can begin to recover those animals so that they don't need the level of protection that they have. That's not to say gut them. That's not to say remove their protections. That's just to say we should celebrate success. And I think as conservationists, we tend to be so browbeaten, and we tend to have experienced so much emotional fatigue that the idea of success is foreign and is weird, strange to celebrate. But we need to get to the point where we can start to celebrate.
So don't go destroying everything because Colossal can bring stuff back.
We can't.
That's
the other thing that's missing. The other thing that's missing in that equation is habitat. It's totally
right. Absolutely.
We are a species preservation restoration company. We hope and we do a lot of habitat work, but without habitat, you can't make a woolly mammoth unless there's somewhere to put it. You can't bring back if we wanted to bring back, say, if we wanted to expand the population of Florida panthers, well, we can't do that without habitat. We have to grow habitat. Right. And you can't recover a population without protecting habitat. And I think that is lost in this debate.
Yeah, huge effort.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a lot of, and you said that really at the top of this conversation about real ecosystem and land restoration and bringing things back to obviously a less human dominated landscape time, but there are places to be able to do this. And look, I for one would love to see, if there's a 1 million acre preserve and you could see the ecological effects of flora, fauna, and everything sort of working together and what it would do to that space, who knows, maybe you could get other entities, countries, whoever on board and understanding that if we ecologically restore not only just the land, the ocean, things like that, we could really do some good.
I know, just for example, of my meetings in Mauritius with the Mauritian government and the leading conservationists in Mauritius. Right? Mauritius used to be this incredible biodiversity hotspot that today only about 2 or 3% of its native ecosystem remains. It's been completely replaced with sugarcane plantations and beachside resorts and things like that. But I know in our talks to them about the dodo, they said, well, where would it go? And you start to identify areas where it goes. And well, we need more space than that. And they say, yeah, we should definitely we could remove these plantations. And you can see them starting to turn back time on things like, what farming and plantations did to the ecosystem. They want to find ways to grow and preserve the native ecosystem of Mauritius. So I love that dodo for them acts as that beacon to call to action, right? It is a call to action to go, not just protect what's left, but to begin to add more habitat.
Wow. I only have a couple more questions. To get a little bit, lighter on the subject, for you as the chief animal officer, Matt, what's something you're looking forward to seeing, doing, experiencing with Khaleesi, Romulus, and Remus in, let's say, the next 6 months as they continue to grow, they continue to figure things out? What's something you're looking forward to?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm just an animal enthusiast like anybody else. So I like being able to go out there and just watch them, like wolves be wolves, that type of thing. Watching them, Romulus and Remus especially are just goofballs. And, sometimes you just think they got noodles for brains with the way that it's goofy and they just roll over each other, right? Like that stuff for me is enthralling. I'll sit there for hours like it's a nature television show, right? But to watch them mature, to watch them sort of fill out their phenotype, to watch them come be some massive Pleistocene wolf is going to be incredible. For Khaleesi, her next step is, she was born a few months later. We have to begin to socially integrate her in with the boys. So that's going to be a huge task for my team. We'll learn a lot. We have a very good sort of stage gated plan to get her into the group. But I think I'm really excited to see her because she's an only child right now. Right? So she was a litter of one. Because she was 3 months younger, she was so much smaller. She couldn't be immediately integrated into the social group. So we're getting ready to do that here in a couple months. I think that'll be really cool because she is the boss already, right? I mean, she's just the demanding only child, and these two goofballs don't know what's about to hit them when she comes in. So that'll be great.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, I meant to ask before, can you talk about the theory of why direwolves went extinct to begin with?
Well, the presence and expansion of the gray wolf was a significant factor in that. So as if you kind of look back at that 15 to 10,000 years ago, large mega herbivores began to sort of fall off. And so their primary prey base was very large mega herbivores. Gray wolves were smaller, more nimble animals. So they were more successful hunters with the smaller prey items like, deer, elk, things that we would see them hunting today. And so it's likely that the direwolf was a little too large to be a successful hunter with those species, while the gray wolf was moving in, was creating the competitive pressure that sort of drove them to extinction. At the same time, humans were there. There was conflict with wolves probably back then, and humans were a competitive hunter.
It seems like, too, just by you saying that, it almost, the relationship between gray wolves and coyotes today is, I guess, would have been similar between dire wolves and gray wolves back then, since they were they were obviously a little bit bigger, but still, has there been any thought or theory around large impacts to the earth, asteroid, things like that, or like regional impacts? I know I've heard some of those theories that it hit a certain part of the earth and the caps melted and all this water was rushing through. Like, is that part of it too?
Like that Younger Dryas theory. Yeah, it was a huge piece of it. We've talked about it. I don't, I'm not a paleontologist. And so I listen to really smart ones talk all the time. And I'm just sort of, flabbergasted by what they know and how they talk about it. But the Younger Dryas theory is definitely, the timing would add up, right? That there was a massive cooling event, that there was a massive rush of water that also changed the landscape. And so, certainly could play a role in that.
This has all just been mind bending, man. I can't even believe it's possible. But is there anything else you want people to know about Colossal? I mean, you've experienced this crazy media boom with congratulations and criticism and everything in between. I mean, is there anything that you want folks to know?
Hey, I think, we're a group of passionate conservationists that come from just a huge variety of background, right? Like everything from the genome engineers on our team and the cell biologists, the guys that sometimes we don't let them out into the light of day because they need to be working, right? They're killing themselves to try to save species from extinction, all the way to the amazing PR team that put together this launch, to the team I get to work with, that spend hours and hours of every day dedicated to the welfare and well-being of our animals. This is, at the end of the day, a group of conservationists leading one of the most innovative conservation projects in the history of the world. You can get caught up in, is it a dire wolf? You were so busy wondering if you could, you forgot to ask if you should. You can debate around the merits of de-extinction. You can debate around the merits of any of it. But at the end of the day, nobody can deny that Colossal is creating technology that is fundamentally changing to the way we can conserve species moving forward. And it's not possible without an amazing team here at Colossal. And I promise you, nobody here is sort of this evil villain, billionaire tech monster that some people have painted us to be. This is a group of really passionate conservationists that are applying technologies in an interesting way.
Did you expect the criticisms before you did it? Were you prepared for them, or?
When we realized the timeline of what direwolf could be, I said, "Oh crap! Like
it's coming.
we're gonna raise some eyebrows." It wasn't when I joined the company. It wouldn't have been how I envisioned we launched our effort. Right? It worked out that way. I think there's a lot of great merit in it. Like I said, I think it follows a lot of the international guidelines that have been put out there for why it should be first. But I did expect there to be a media spectacle, and I did expect there to be controversy. However, I didn't think the controversy would be around it's not a direwolf, it is a direwolf. I thought it'd be much more around it's a giant wolf. What the hell are you doing?
I mean, in some ways, you might have gotten out in front of that. I mean, if that's the criticism or most of the criticism, then it's probably a little bit better off there. I mean, this is all wild stuff. I mean, Stephen's right. Just this is, but incredibly informative too. And I think we've really run the gamut of the stuff that we really wanted to know, and I hopefully bring, like you say, the reasons and the mission forward of what you guys are trying to do there. And that's really what it's about, is getting the correct information out there. So you've done an incredible job, Matt. Thank you for all this. Yeah, I mean, my last question, as I ask everybody, is when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
For the rest of my life, it will be that first direwolf howl. Right, the first time I heard that little guy howl, I mean, wolf for me forever is now direwolf.
We'll never have that answer again. That's for sure.
That's for sure.
And I imagine you've gotten a lot of T-Rex emails as well.
Yeah, we get a lot of Jeff Goldblum gifts. We get a lot of emails.
The mosquito.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. John Hammond, welcome to whatever. That's crazy. I've seen a couple of those.
So I imagine the Jurassic Park theme song to be playing when we show up eventually.
Exactly.
Well, and you'll be picked up in a yellow Jeep.
Exactly. I can't wait.
As long as I get to wear Muldoon's hat on the ride, I don't care. That's fine with me. Man, Matt James, Chief Animal Officer, Colossal Biosciences. Thank you, man. This has been great. Yeah, thank you for taking our questions, being upfront with everything. Really appreciate you, man. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, guys. It's fun. We'll do it again.
Heck yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just hang tight while we sign off, Matt. How's to you all out there? Be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.